as I say, thank you very much for the opportunity. A little bit of an introduction for me. Obviously, I'm Finance Advocacy Officer at the Deep Sea Mining Campaign, as this says. I'll explain more about what our finance work is. I have a long background working in mining on land, particularly supporting Indigenous communities, and particularly around Southeast Asia. So, a long time working in the Philippines. And through that, I ended up working on deep sea mining. But as you will see when we talk, I think a lot of our focus is particularly around working with communities. So that's where I've shared a lot of that, a lot of the ideas that I've learned. So my plan is to explain, first of all, a brief introduction to my organization, the Deep Sea Mining Campaign. I know that you've already had different speakers talk about deep sea mining, so I don't want to talk for too long on the issue, but in case you didn't attend the others, or in case there are new ideas, it's worth doing a quick background on deep sea mining, but I'll try to keep it short. Then I'll talk about very briefly about the research work that my colleague, Dr. Helen Rosenbaum, works on. Then a little bit on the solidarity work, particularly in Papua New Guinea, and then more, and I think it will be more, obviously, on the area of work that I do on the finance work. So the Deep Sea Mining Campaign, we are a fairly small organization. We are really a campaign. We're an association of different NGOs and citizens that came together. We were founded in 2011. And that was in direct response to the Nautilus mine in Papua New Guinea, which I'll talk about. And that was a lot of where our original focus was. But since then, we've grown, particularly as the threat of deep sea mining has grown to be global. So now our overall goal is to prevent deep sea mining in the Pacific Ocean with our Pacific partners, but also beyond. So we are an alliance, and we work sort of in alliance and solidarity with different communities. As I mentioned, we're quite community focused, particularly in Papua New Guinea, in other countries, and I'll talk about those later. But I mean, we see the success of our work really rooted in the relationships we've got with civil society organizations, again, particularly in PNG and particularly in the Pacific. And we work on a number of different strategies, a number of different focuses. The first is on research. So we're looking mainly for sort of science and evidence-based advocacy. We then work in support and capacity building with community organizations, particularly in the Pacific, and often supporting where we can sort of legal remedies for them. And then, as mentioned, the final sort of third part of our work is around the finance advocacy. These are some of the research we've done. I'll come back to this slide to talk about the research, but the reason for putting this in is to note at the top that we are supported financially through Mining Watch Canada and the Ocean Foundation, which are the two logos on the top left. And we work very closely with the Alliance of Sawara Warriors, which is the logo on the top right. But we are also a member of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, which is the global network of groups, alliance of groups who are working on deep sea mining, so including the likes of Greenpeace and WWF, the World Wildlife Foundation. So now a little bit on deep sea mining. Again, apologies if all of this is known, but worth just stating the obvious in case. So clearly it's about the mining of metals, a whole lot of different metals. And generally, it's defined as deep sea when it's anything below 200 meters, although sometimes that varies, but generally speaking, we're concerned about anything that's deeper than 200 meters. So there are generally three different distinct types of mining, all situated in different environments and situated with different ecosystems. The first, which is the picture on the top left, is seafloor massive sulfides, or basically almost underwater volcanoes, which are very rich in metals. The second known as cobalt-rich crusts, which is basically where an underwater mountain kind of has a crust of metal that's formed over it. And then the final type is called polymetallic or manganese nodules. And these are nodules that look like lumps of coal, which you can see in the bottom left, that are sitting on the very, very deep, flat seabed on what are known as the abyssal plains, but basically flat seabed. And all of those types of mining are, have their own unique problems. And we can maybe come back in questions to what those are, but they all have, they all have their own concerns. But then to say there are also to note that there are two separate jurisdictions, so two separate types of areas it can be done in. The first is in the territorial waters of a country, which is often known as exclusive economic zones, or EEZs. So basically, it's where a country, anything up to 200 miles from the coast and sometimes a little further. Then the other type of jurisdiction is when it's in international waters, often called the high seas, or the seabed is known as the area. And then finally, just to note that there's no commercial mining has taken place. There's been some very large scale test mining, but no one has actually done commercial mining either in territorial waters or in international waters. So as I'll be talking about Papua New Guinea, just a quick mention about hydrothermal vents or seafloor massive sulfides. So basically, it happens around areas of volcanic activity. It's about 1 kilometer to 4 kilometers down. You can have active or inactive vents. So you can have underwater volcanoes that are still venting, still active, or ones that have stopped. Either case, generally speaking, now most people are trying to stop the idea of mining on active vents, mainly because there are very unique life forms that live there. However, you could argue that both types of vents are high in biodiversity and they both have issues. So, and as mentioned, this is a particular focus for mining in Papua New Guinean territorial waters. And if it happens, you're looking at mining for copper, lead, zinc, gold, and silver. So mentioned the three different types of mining. They all generally work on the same principle, which is that you either crush up the rock if you're mining at hydrothermal vents or cobalt crusts, or in the case of the manganese nodules, you're sucking them off the seafloor with the seafloor. They're pulled up what's called a riser pipe, so they move up towards a ship on the surface, which processes them, and then they're returned. Any waste that comes back is returned back down a return pipe. And there are a number of issues that can happen, a number of concerns around mining, some of which are listed here on the right. The main ones that are mostly concerning are with plumes, which is PLUME, which is basically dust clouds that come up. So these dust plumes, they rise from either where the mining is happening or from where the waste is returned. And you can have, but basically problems with life forms being covered by the plumes. But there is also issues around noise and issues around light. And also worth remembering that there's not just environmental concerns, that there are also economic and social risks. You could have potential problems with other types of industry, such as fishery or tourism, being impacted, or even social and cultural rights, particularly for people living in the Pacific, where they regard the whole of the ocean as sacred. So then just to stress, for me, I think there are two real concerns why deep sea mining is especially problematic. And I think the first is in loss to biodiversity. So it's key that there will be a loss of biodiversity in these areas, but perhaps most importantly, we don't yet know how big the losses are going to be because we just don't understand what's down there. And that's a real problem because we're not even sure what we don't know. There's been so relatively little research done, and it's so difficult to do the research. So there's two papers that are quoted here, and the bottom paper was an attempt by different scientists, Diva Amon and a number of other scientists, to try and quantify the gaps and understand. And basically, they concluded that there were huge amounts of gaps there. And that's a real problem, because if you don't even know what you may lose, then it's very difficult to work out what where you should start, what you can do to mitigate any problems, what you can do to make the problems better. And then the second reason, I think, for concern specifically on deep sea mining is the lifespans of any life that's there. And because you're dealing with very hostile environments, the life forms that are there tend to grow and live on very, very long time scales. The picture that's here on the top left is a picture of one of the earliest experiments, which is just over 30 years ago. There was actually German researchers dragged a sledge across the seabed, not far off the Peruvian coast. Went back again about just over 30 years later, and effectively this is a picture of that 30 years later. So you can see hardly anything has changed in that 30 years. So we have a real problem if we're going to move forward very quickly with deep sea mining, because we don't know what's down there, and we haven't really had the time to understand what the impacts are likely to be. And the picture that's at the bottom here is of one of a prototype to mine the polymetallic nodules, and that's a scale model. Probably when they do finally mine, if they do, then these will be about 8 times bigger than the scale model that's there. So then, just to say, where will mining take place? It could pretty much be anywhere around the world, really. But you'll see from this map, a lot of it is centered around the Pacific. The map has been specifically drawn to kind of show that the Pacific is central to a great deal of the concerns around deep sea mining. Generally, the polymetallic nodules are in the international waters and cobalt-rich crust in international waters. The polymetallic sulfides may be a little bit more in territorial waters, but there's no clear rule, and you will see that overlaps in different places as well. And just to note that the area that's marked in the middle there, the Clarion-Clipperton zone, that's the main area that there's most concern to mine now in international waters, and it's where most of the leases to mine are currently active. So in terms of the processes for international mining, so that the governance for it is with the International Seabed Authority, which is made up of 36 countries in a council, but 168 countries in a much larger assembly, plus the EU. And the assembly members are pretty much everyone that's signed up to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the governing document for seabed mining. So they have rules for exploration. So they have rules to try and explore and discover what's there, but there are no rules for exploitation. So there are no rules for mining starting. And they're currently negotiating those, and it's been going for a number of years now. It's predicted maybe that we will start in 2025, but at the end of 2025 that the rules may be finished. But there is actually a meeting going on at the moment, and the way things are looking, even the end of 2025 looks optimistic. But worth noting that in June 2021, there is a clause of the operation agreement of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And in that treaty, there's a rule that's known generally as the 2-year rule, that says that if a country believes that there is unnecessary delay in negotiations, then it can file under the 2-year rule to start mining regardless of where the rules are. I mean, we can talk more in questions on this. I mean, yeah, the whole point of it, I think, was to just in case there was large-scale stalling. I don't think that's the case now. You know, I think the rules are being negotiated in good faith. It's just taking time because they're complex. However, Nauru basically triggered that ruling, and because of that, you know, they can 2 years later, as of July 2023, they, in theory, could start mining with their the company that they are working with, called the Metals Company. But I mean, that's in theory. It's still not clear if they decided to mine exactly how that would work, especially as there are no agreed rules in place at the moment. Then just a very quick kind of overview of, you know, how many companies there are that are interested in deep sea mining. These are just for international waters, but generally speaking, there are not many companies that are involved in deep sea mining. Generally speaking, the companies that are attached to a state, they're either public bodies. So in the case of Germany and France, you see that these are basically government research agencies that are involved. But in some cases, and I think particularly tied to Pacific Islands, you'll see that some companies now have basically done deals with those countries. And the most notable one here, although UK Seabed Resources is tied to the United Kingdom, and also in the case of Belgium, there's Global Seabed Mineral Resources. So both of those are active companies, but the main company is the Metals Company, formerly known as Deep Green, and that has, you know, deals at the moment with Nauru, with Tonga, and also an agreement with Kiribati. And very briefly, just to say, you know, why is it necessary? Well, those who want deep sea mining to happen are saying that it's going to be more environmentally friendly than terrestrial mining. That's most definitely disputed. You know, that's not a fact. And it's very difficult to compare them. Also, the main argument for moving quickly in doing it is that we need the metals for the energy transition. Again, that's disputed. And here, you'll see the cover of a European Academy Science Advisory Council, or ESAC, statement where they review the different scientific literature, economic literature, and they basically say that, you know, they refute that case. They say it's not the case that we need it there. Also, you know, there's a claim that we're only going to be mining a small amount of the seabed, but because the areas that we're talking about are so huge, I mean, a single lease in the Clarion-Clipperton zone covers an area of about 1/3 the size of Belgium, and there are a large number of leases in that area. And then pretty much finally, just on the general points around deep sea mining, I think because of those points that I mentioned, which is, you know, that there are so many unknowns, and we need time to find out, you know, what the problems will be in terms of biodiversity. And, you know, we don't need the rush that's been said for energy transition materials. There are calls growing for a moratorium, for some sort of moratorium or a pause or a ban on deep sea mining. So now 24 countries have come forward. Actually, it shows Mexico there. The last one to come forward is actually Denmark. So in fact, there's an even newer one than that, because Denmark just announced in the current meeting in Jamaica that they're also supporting the idea of a pause. So you have all of these, including the European Union. You have France calling for a ban. You also have a large number of Pacific civil society groups and talking about a ban. They come together under the Pacific Blue Line, where they're saying, you know, they don't want deep sea mining happening under any circumstances. You have a large number of scientists calling for it, but you also have a large number of business actors that includes investors. And there's No Seabed Mining website. The link is there, and it's run by World Wildlife Foundation. And that basically they are arguing that, you know, there are businesses who are arguing that it's not necessary and calling for a moratorium. And then finally, to note that the Congress of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is made up of governments and non-governmental organizations, you know, voted in favor of a moratorium. Okay, sorry that may have taken some time, but hopefully that was useful. I'm sure I can come back to more questions anyway. I said I would come back to this slide because this pretty much lays out some of our major reports. A few of these reports are slightly old, so they're focused on Papua New Guinea. Out of Our Depth was, which you can see in the top left of the six, was and Accountability Zero at the top right, were very much critiquing the Nautilus project in Papua New Guinea I mentioned. Then we also had two direct critiques of what little had been put out in terms of the assessments of the company, an overview of Chinese activity, but then the most recent reports, the one on the bottom right is called Why the Rush, which I would recommend, which is really looking at why these companies are trying to set up a rush for deep sea mining and whether it's necessary. And then the one on the left of all of them, predicting the impacts of mining deep sea polymetallic nodules, is a review of the scientific literature, looking at what the impact of mining those polymetallic nodules will be. And then the last piece of research that we've done, sort of major research, which Jan Bingle may have talked about last week because we did it with Oceania Dialogue. This is called Blue Peril, and it's mainly a video, short video, which you can download and look at through the Blue Peril website, which is there. And it's an attempt to see how far, what the impact would be of the plumes that I mentioned earlier. So how far they would spread and what their impact would be, looking at the best scientific data that we can. So we ran simulations, and the simulations show that the impacts of these plumes could be very far-reaching, and that from one of the metals companies' areas which we looked at, which was under the subsidiary from Nauru, that it wouldn't take long before the plumes reached Hawaii. So they're likely to be far-ranging. Interestingly, the metals company have recently refuted that. They say they've done more research, particularly they say they've done research and the plumes don't spread very far. However, their research is on what happens at the impact on the seafloor, whereas the work that was done mainly around Blue Peril is looking at what happens at the return pipes, so when the waste is returned. And because that's not necessarily on the seafloor, that's where you would actually have much wider dispersal of these plumes. So now, if I can, I will talk very briefly on the campaign work we're doing in Papua New Guinea. So I think I mentioned at the start, mostly what we've done is work around supporting groups who've been opposing the Sawara 1 project. So this was one of the first mining projects that was ever given a license to proceed to actually mine. So and basically the original license was given in 2011. And there was a huge civil society opposition to this. And we've worked mainly with the group, the Alliance of Sawara Warriors, who have been mobilizing local communities, who in theory should be able to have some form of consultation or consent, but in practice, haven't really had, that hasn't been done properly. So they've been mobilizing communities to say that they don't want the mining to happen, and particularly that they want all of the mining licenses to be cancelled. So we've worked supporting them financially with campaign advice and trying to do international support where necessary, particularly around sort of press and social media. We've also supported legal work. There's a Papua New Guinean legal organization called CELCOR, and there's been an ongoing court case to get the government to share Nautilus material, including their impact statements, basically to get more transparency, and the government have been fighting that. And that's still going on through the courts now. In theory, the case has been won, but the government is still opposing. Also, Interestingly, we thought we had won because, as I'll mention on the finance part later on, the licenses should have been cancelled in 2019 when the company went bankrupt. But actually, out of his bankruptcy, there was a new organization kind of came in and overtook them called Deep Sea Mining Finance. And they are still ongoing. So basically, they're pushing to start again. And this is despite the fact that the government is committed to a moratorium. So it's kind of crazy that the government is still pushing forward, even though in theory their policy is a moratorium on deep sea mining. And then also to note that we're working kind of increasingly across the wider Pacific with the like of the Pacific Asia Research Network, PANG, Civil Society Forum of Tonga, and TIS, Tiapakuria Society in the Cook Islands. So just a couple of quick slides on Papua New Guinea. So this is where the Sawara 1 project is. And you'll see there is a large overlap with various fishing grounds. At points, it's only 30 kilometres from the coast of New Ireland. So there's a clear impact that would happen in terms of traditional fishing. And local communities are aware of that. They have definite concerns if it starts, what the impact will be on fishing. We've been working with communities all across the areas that would be affected. And again, they've themselves expressed all sorts of concerns, particularly around deep sea mining, but also around whether they've been consulted, the fact that there's been no real consent involved in a lot of the push from the company for deep sea mining to start. And then both across the regions, churches have been particularly important, Lutheran Church, and also working with Caritas with the Catholic Church. So they've been mobilizing groups to spread concern around deep sea mining through congregations, etc. So then the last thing to point out is some of the communities there have engaged what they call the Gilgal Protocol. So effectively, this is traditional custodial idea that they have effectively customary areas of the sea, which are under traditional law, shouldn't be invaded, shouldn't be trespassed on. So here you see someone actually putting out kind of what's effectively markers in the sea to mark out what those areas are. So already traditional people are mobilizing with their customary law to say that if deep sea mining happens, they will resist it. And now I'll finish off just to talk a little bit more about the area that I'm involved in, which is the finance advocacy work. So in terms of the finance advocacy, there's two main areas that we work on. The first is to kind of encourage divestment, so to stop investment in particular companies. And the companies we mainly worked on are Nautilus in Papua New Guinea and the Metals Company, which I mentioned a couple of times already. But also to explain the risks generally of deep sea mining to financiers or insurers and ideally to get them to enact policies to ensure they don't invest in deep sea mining. So in terms of Nautilus, I mean, that's where the finance campaign work started. We realized that there was an international opportunity to support communities around Nautilus, to explain the community position and what the risks in the project were to financiers. So we approached a number of different financiers. Interestingly, one of them was a mining company, a terrestrial mining company, a land-based mining company called Anglo-American. And Anglo-American had a 7% share in the project or in Nautilus. So we met with them, it explains the concerns, and in the end, Anglo-American divested. So they took their shares, sold their shares. And they were probably the most famous, but there are a number of other investors that also pulled out. And partly because of that, although mainly because of the community campaigns of people saying no and the court cases, in the end, Nautilus went bankrupt. So in 2019, it was declared insolvent in the Canadian courts. However, as I mentioned earlier, the two main investors in the company, who are a company called MB Holdings, which is linked to the royal family of Oman, and another company called Metallo Invest, which is linked to a Russian oligarch. Neither of which are probably the ideal investors. They effectively took over what was left. So they've ended up with the license and the assets. And as I mentioned, they're still pushing to mine in the area, despite the fact there's very little transparency. They're actually registered in the British Virgin Islands, which is a sort of secrecy location. So they don't have to disclose any of their finances. So it's very difficult for us to actually, to work out, us or Papua New Guinean partners, to work out, who is really involved and whether they have the money to move forward. And the other company that we're focused on, I mentioned, is the metals company. Many of the people who were involved in Nautilus ended up being involved in the metals company. Some of them kind of moved on, particularly the CEO of the metals company, called Gerard Barron, who was an original investor in Nautilus. And they are really the main company that are pushing hardest and fastest with their Pacific allies like Nauru and Tonga, to mine quickly in international waters. They became the metals company in 2021 when they merged with a sort of an type of investment vehicle called a SPAC. It's horrible and complicated. I don't really want to go into it unless you unless you want me to explain. But effectively, it's a way of people investing in a general company that they don't know what the investment's going to be, but they trust the people to come up with a good investment. And this particular one, called SOAC, chose Deep Green, and together they've become the metals company. And we worked at the time, the shareholder advisor, we worked to try and point out what the risks were. It's registered the Security Exchange Commission in the US, and we basically got them to revise their prospectus, to revise their what they were using to explain to investors about the project. And we got them to revise it a few times because they were understating the risks. And eventually, when the merger happened, the vast majority of people from this investment company chose not to invest in the new company, including two major investors who'd already made a promise to do so, which is very, very rare. So since then, it's lost a huge. It started around $10. It's now about $1.80, but they're still. They've been given two notices to delist from NASDAQ, the exchange that they're on. But we continue to point out the risks that are involved around the company. My last couple of slides, just to say, I think there is growing investor concern, understanding around deep sea mining. The United Nations Environment Programme, which offers advice to investors, has produced a couple of reports, one of which was almost specifically on deep sea mining. And in that, they concluded that deep sea mining could not be considered sustainable. And the high level panel for sustainable ocean economy have said the same thing, that basically you can't have an industry like deep sea mining and say in any way that it's part of a sustainable blue economy. And then my very final slide is just to note that I mentioned that we were talking to different investors. We now have 10 private investors to date who have some form of policies that explicitly withdraw support from deep sea mining, plus the European Investment Bank, which is a public financier. So basically it provides money through governments. And all of those, so 11 institutions in total, including Swiss Re insurers, have all basically said that they, in some form or other, have policies that say they will not support deep sea mining. And our job is to talk to more of them, and hopefully, we think particularly over time with insurers, it will be likely that a larger number will come forward once they understand what the risks are, because we think it's not only a reputational risk but also clearly a financial risk as well. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing at that point.